The fate of Ferrus Manus, much like his death, is steeped in many myths and rumors, along with conflicting accounts. While some stories suggest that Fulgrim presented his severed head to Horus as a grim trophy of victory, others posit a more insidious fate. Some claim that the agents of the Dark Mechanicum, seeking to use Ferrus' genetic material to forge a new twisted legion of Astartes, stole his remains. Alternatively, there are those who believe that his body was, at least in part, recovered by his sons, the Iron Hands, and that certain members of his legion still search for his remains to this very day. And in some of these tales, Ferrus Manus is not truly dead, but rather hidden away, waiting for the moment of his return. However, despite the myths, the Iron Hands themselves had steadfastly refused to accept their own Primarch's death. Their belief that Ferrus Manus somehow survived the atrocities of Isstvan V has provided them with some measure of solace, albeit one that many of them would admit is rather delusional. This hope of his return, however, would do little to heal the wound inflicted upon the Legion. Their ranks had been shattered, their pride deeply wounded, and the loss of their Primarch left them feeling rather hollow. The Iron Hands themselves would return to their homeworld of Medusa, consumed by bitterness, anger, and grief. In the wake of their defeat, the Iron Hands' resentment did not once diminish, as no one would be spared from the icy glare of their fury, not the traitors, not the Xenos, and in some instances, not even their former allies. A particular scorn was reserved for the Raven Guard and the Salamanders, who, in the Iron Hands' view, had failed to follow Ferrus Manus into the fray, and were the primary reason that he had died. They believed that if they had fought on, the traitors would have been defeated, despite the numerical advantage that the traitors had at the end of the day. But the resentment did not end with their comrades. The Iron Hands would also turn said hatred inward. Filled with a self-loathing that bordered on lunacy, they would blame their defeat on Isstvan, not only to the traitors, but to themselves, and in particular onto their veterans, who had failed to overcome the challenges of battle, and even on Ferrus Manus himself, despite his shortcomings. They saw the tactical decisions he made as clouded by emotion, rather than being led by cold logic, said logic which had once defined them. His impulsiveness, they believed, had doomed them all, and his flawed judgment had ultimately led not only to their loss in battle, but to the eventual losses of their Primarch, along with the Emperor and Sanguinius. Three great losses that they would see themselves at least partly responsible for. Even more painful was the realization that their legion, while highly disciplined, lacked the psychological and physical fortitude required to overcome such nigh unwinnable odds. In the years that followed, the Iron Hands would embark on a ruthless and relentless campaign of self-improvement, driven by an obsessive need to erase the perceived weaknesses that had contributed to their downfall. Their failures at Isstvan V became the catalyst for this transformation, as they sought to eliminate the very humanity that had once defined them. The Iron Hands would begin to coldly embrace the process of mechanical augmentation by replacing flesh with steel, muscle with machine, as cybernetics would become a symbol of their legion and a manifestation of their rejection of their former selves. Through this relentless pursuit of physical and psychological perfection, they aimed to ensure that no weakness, no emotion, and no flaw would ever again stain their honor or stand in the way of their vengeance. Now, in the direct aftermath of the catastrophic dropsite massacre on Isstvan V, a small fleet of loyalist Astartes, consisting primarily of survivors of the shattered Iron Hands and Raven Guard legions, managed to escape the planet's doomed surface. Amongst the vessels they were able to procure was the Isstvan, a strike cruiser commanded by the mortally wounded Iron Hands captain Uruk Branthan. Despite their grievous losses, these survivors remained determined to continue to fight against the traitor legions, vowing to strike wherever they could. While in flight, the crew of the Isstvan intercepted encrypted communications revealing a disturbing truth. The traitor Primarchs, Fulgrim and Perturabo, were leading their legions into the warp rift that would come to be known as the Eye of Terror. Their mission was to obtain an unknown Aldari weapon referred to as the Angelus Exterminatus, which could decisively tilt the scales of the Horus Heresy in the favor of the traitors, even more so than they currently were. The Iron Hands, alongside the other loyalist survivors of the Dropsite Massacre, swiftly assembled a fleet of their own in order to pursue the traitors into the Eye of Terror. Once within the dangerous, chaotic region, the two Primarchs, Fulgrim and Perturabo, led their combined forces onto the Eldari crone world of Lydris. There, in the ancient citadel known as Amon Nyai Shak Kills, they believed the Angel Exterminatus lay hidden. However, the quest for the weapon would prove to be nothing more than a ruse by Fulgrim. as unbeknownst to Perturabo and the Iron Warriors, Fulgrim had orchestrated their entire mission to the service of his own dark ambitions. Now, as a champion of Slaanesh, the chaos god of excess and pleasure, Fulgrim sought to ascend to demonhood and become a demon prince, nay, a demon Primarch. To do so, he needed not only the power of an Eldari crone world, but the life force of another Primarch. This was the true purpose of the Angel Exterminatus, to provide the necessary power Fulgrim needed for living apotheosis. In his deceit, Fulgrim had given Perturabo a cloak bearing a skull-shaped pin that contained a relic known as a Magatar stone. As long as Perturabo remained within the citadel, and with the stone near his personhood, it would slowly drain his life force, feeding it directly to Fulgrim. Yet it would not be until Perturabo discovered this treachery that the Iron Warriors would turn against their supposed allies. What followed would be a brutal three-way melee as the Iron Hands, under the command of Captain Barathan, entered the fray between the two Traitor Legions. Unaware of the true nature of the conflict and the possibility of slaying 1 to 2 traitor Primarchs. In the ensuing chaos, Perturabo, enraged by Fulgrim's betrayal, seemingly slew the Primarch of the Emperor's Children with the mighty Warhammer Forgebreaker, a weapon that had originally been forged by Fulgrim himself for Ferrus Manus. However, this act of vengeance proved to be all within Fulgrim's plans. Fulgrim's death was merely the final act in his ritual of ascension. His body, no longer bound to its mortal constraints, would transform into a twisted serpentine form, making his successful rise as the first traitor Primarch to fully become a demon prince. With his transformation complete, Fulgrim would teleport his Emperor's Children away from the collapsing Crone world, as the energies that had kept the ancient Eldari site from collapsing into the Eye of Terror had been drained for Fulgrim's ascension, and Lydris began to crumble, its long-guarded secrets to be lost to the void forevermore. Though the Iron Hands and Perturabo's Iron Warriors would manage to escape, Perturabo would take his fleet deeper into the Eye of Terror, seeking refuge within the depths of the black hole at its center. The battle at Lydris marked a missed opportunity by the remaining shattered legions within the Isstvan to potentially take down a weakened Perturabo at the cost of their own lives, and the situation would become increasingly common as the grip of the dark gods tightened around Horus's followers, as Fulgrim's ascension to demonhood would not be the last of its kind, but merely the first of many. Following this, there would be a series of battles and engagements that the Iron Hands would take part in. Starting in 008 M31, the Iron Hands, led by the infamous Iron Father Atruk Mor of the Morgul clan, launched a brutal and decisive attack on the World Eaters' Fife world of Bobt. The World Eaters had long used this planet as both a training ground for the Legion, as well as a vital recruitment hub, sending initiates of their ranks, both to and from the world. However, the Iron Father, driven by his deep and unending hatred, led an allied loyalist strike force into a merciless campaign to sever Bobt's role in supporting the traitors. After a vicious battle, Mor was believed to have entered the subterranean macro vaults beneath the capital city of Tradameka, where he pursued his final objective, utterly scouring the planet of all life. The attack was excruciatingly devastating in scope, as the world's surface was stripped of every trace of life, and the infrastructure of the planet utterly annihilated. The World Eaters, who had heavily relied on this world for their supply of initiates, were left without this vital source of replenishment, weakening their overall positions in the heresy. This was not just a tactical strike, it was a message of vengeance. With the destruction of this world, the Iron Hands were able to deal the traitors' premier assault army a serious blow by destroying their recruitment and logistic chain, leaving the World Eaters reeling. At the same time, in 008 M31, on the Forge world of Unmat in the Ultima Segmentum, a civil war erupted as the Synod Magos, once united under the banner of the Imperium, found themselves fractured by their tenuous loyalties to different factions. One faction supported the Loyalists, while another pledged their allegiance to the traitors. This conflict quickly escalated, drawing the Sons of Horus and the Iron Hand survivors of Isstvan into the fray. The clash between these forces turned Oman Mat into a battlefield of industrial warfare, with towering manufactorum complexes and forges now serving as a backdrop to deadly, unending combat. The battles within the Forge world and its hallowed halls were rather brutal, but the devastation would reach far beyond that battlefield, as Oman Mat had been utterly destroyed in the resulting conflagration of war. with fires that raged on for weeks, consuming the once advanced Forge world and leaving it in a charred, ruined state. Some of its fires are said to still smolder to this day, as a testament to the devastation wrought during the ensuing conflict some 10,000 years ago. For the people of the Imperium, the fall of Owen Mat marked the end of a significant industrial hub, but it also revealed a deepening fracture within the Mechanicum, one that would have far-flung consequences as the heresy progressed. In 010 through 011 M31, the Battle of Talran would occur, and perhaps no battle during the Horus Heresy remains as iconic as this one, and it would become, and remains to this day, one of the largest amassed tank battles in Imperial history, as the Iron Warriors Traitor Legion launched a massive assault on the agri-world of Talran, a rather unassuming planet that had once been rather fertile and a life-sustaining breadbasket for the Imperium. To prepare the ground for their invasion, the Iron Warriors virus-bombed the planet, unleashing the deadly Life Eater virus. This virulent pathogen quickly turned Talran into a barren wasteland, its once verdant fields reduced to endless deserts, rendering the planet nigh uninhabitable and its population trapped in its underground shelters. As the planet's surface lay wasted, these survivors would emerge, rather determined and incensed, in order to defend their world. The Loyalists, including elements of the Iron Hands and the Imperial Fists, responded in kind, launching a counteroffensive to prevent the traitor forces from taking control of this world. What followed was a conflict unlike any other, fought primarily within the sealed, battle-torn hulls of armored fighting vehicles. Tank divisions from both sides engaged in brutal combat, deploying armored units in numbers never seen before in any single engagement. The battle would go on to rage on for months, without any end, as both sides suffered horrendous casualties. Despite their best efforts, the Iron Warriors would eventually be driven from Talran by the Loyalist forces. In the aftermath, the once vibrant world was left as an echo of its former self, its surface littered with the wreckage of over 1 million destroyed tanks, their rusting hulls scattered across the endless dunes of sand. Talran had become a desolate graveyard. For the Iron Hands and the Imperial Fists, the loss of the world itself represented more than just a military defeat. It was a deep wound that they would never forget. The world, once a symbol of Imperial abundance, had been transformed into a graveyard of tanks and a ruin that would be an insult haunting the two legions for millennia to come. Years later, the people of Talran would learn the horrifying truth behind the Iron Warriors' invasion. The traitors had not merely come to conquer, but to claim the Cursus of Alganor, a dark and ancient chaotic artifact that acted as a gateway into the realms of chaos within the warp. This revelation would send shockwaves throughout the Imperium, exposing yet another layer of treachery that had occurred throughout the Horus Heresy, further cementing the deep rift between the Loyalist and traitor forces, even those who had surrendered. The Battle of Talran remains a haunting one indeed, as it was not just a battle for a world, but for the very soul of the Imperium, leaving the defenders with a mere Pyrrhic victory. With the Horus Heresy, a rather climactic chapter in the history of the Imperium concluded. Over the course of 8 harrowing years, the galaxy was left broken and bleeding, as the forces of Horus, the War Master of the Traitor Legions, had launched a devastating assault on Terra. But despite their initial successes during the siege of the Imperial Palace, the traitors would be ultimately defeated and the scouring would begin. Horus had been slain and the Emperor mortally wounded in the final confrontation, leading the God Emperor to be inducted and interred within the Golden Throne, his body now a husk, his mind unreachable. The dream of a united Imperium that the Emperor had envisioned now lay in ruins. The Imperium, though fractured, was not entirely powerless in the aftermath of the Horus Heresy. The survivors rallied their strengths, driven by vengeance and a desire to restore what they could of the Emperor's legacy, would lead a counteroffensive. Yet the cost of the heresy had been immense. Great swaths of humanity's star-spanning empire had been ravaged by the war and treachery. The Imperial Palace itself, once a symbol of humanity's grandeur and artistic, along with societal brilliance, had been scorched black by the fires of betrayal. Despite this devastation, the Imperium still had sufficient strength to strike back against its enemies with an unrelenting fury. No forgiveness could be granted towards the traitors, who had forsaken their oaths and defied the Emperor's name. The survivors, who still held to the Emperor's vision, were bound by a singular, nigh obsessive mission: retribution. 014 M31 would be the beginning of something known as the Great Scouring. The Great Scouring was the Imperium's vast and violent counteroffensive against the Traitor Legions. It began immediately after the failure of the siege of the Imperial Palace. With the death of Horus in the early decades of M31, the Imperium would unleash its wrath. This was not just war, it was a relentless purge. The Imperium sought to drive the forces of chaos out of the heart of human-controlled space, forcing them into the warp and into a permanent refuge within the Eye of Terror. During this period of monumental violence, the Imperium sought to reclaim what had been lost and to punish those who had betrayed it. The Inquisition would be founded and tasked with rooting out corruption within the remnants of the Imperium, exposing those who had fallen prey to heresy. Yet the vastness of the galaxy ensured that many of these betrayals would remain unseen, or would take decades upon decades to root out, allowing their perpetrators to continue their dark deeds in secret. The wars of the Great Scouring, though seemingly a united front, were marked by chaos and infighting amongst the loyalist forces. The Space Marine legions, still reeling from the devastation of the heresy, were not exempt from this turmoil. While many, such as the Dark Angels, Space Wolves, and Ultramarines, would follow their own path of vengeance, their own path in the pursuit of vengeance, each faction would pursue their own agenda in the wider conflicts. The Iron Hands, so too, were no strangers to the bitter and relentless nature of the Scouring. The Iron Hands, having suffered greatly at the hands of their former brothers during the Horus Heresy, were determined not only to seek retribution, but to expunge the remnants of weakness from their ranks. Their efforts during the Scouring were focused on hunting down traitors, along with engaging in savage warfare against the remnants of the heretic legions, and seeking justice for losses they had endured. The scars of the Horus Heresy remained fresh in their minds. Their quest for vengeance at that time was relentless. In this chaotic, violent period, the borders of the Imperium were constantly shifting, as new betrayals and cries of vengeance emerged daily, and the forces of chaos fought tooth and nail to retain what little grip they had on the galaxy. The Great Scouring was a time of unparalleled carnage and confusion. Its impact on the Imperium and the galaxy as a whole would resonate for millennia to come. Yet despite this overwhelming destruction and loss, the Imperium remained united under one singular goal: expunge every last remnant of the traitors and restore order to the galaxy, avenging the Emperor's fall by hook or by crook. The devastating losses of the Dropsite Massacre had left the Iron Hands shattered, their spirits broken by the betrayal of their brothers and the death of their Primarch. In the aftermath, their legion in large part withdrew to their homeworld of Medusa, the weight of their trauma pressing heavily upon them. As the survivors reflected on the carnage that they had endured, a profound despair gripped their ranks. But this sorrow was not the final emotion that would define the legion. The bitterness of loss would transform into a seething rage, not just towards the Traitor Legions, but towards the Chaos Space Marines in particular, who had led their brothers astray. This fury would soon become a devastating force in the Iron Hand struggle to inflict greater and greater wounds upon those within leadership of the heresy. The Legion, once a mighty force, now was a shadow of itself. The brutality of the Dropsite Massacre had left the scars of death and destruction running far deeper into their flesh than it otherwise would have, affecting the very soul of the Iron Hand. Many within the Legion could not accept the death of Ferrus Manus, clinging to the belief that he could be saved or that his absence was only temporary. In the face of this collective grief, the survivors would reshape their identity during the Scouring of the Iron Hands forevermore. A council of Iron Fathers and clan leaders would convene on Medusa, marking the beginning of a new era for the Iron Hands. With the death of Ferrus Manus, the Legion could not afford to remain leaderless. A decision was reached. No single individual would ever be allowed to hold dominion again, in order to prevent such atrocities as those which occurred by following the singular leadership of Ferrus Manus. Instead, the Iron Council would become the governing body, a collective of wise and seasoned leaders tasked with guiding the future of the Iron Hands. And said Iron Council would function as a way to mitigate negative emotions by spreading them throughout a larger body rather than a singular individual. This marked a pivotal shift in their internal restructure, one that was vastly different from that of any of the other future chapters of Space Marines. In the aftermath of the Horus Heresy, the Imperial forces had indeed rallied to avenge the Emperor and purge the traitors from the galaxy. The Iron Hands took a different path. Rather than rushing headlong into a blind vengeance like so many other factions, the Iron Hands did indeed send some forces to wreak vengeance, but in large part they retreated to Medusa to contemplate their new place in the galaxy and to assess their purpose, all the while assuring their actions were not driven by the same emotions that had caused the downfall of their Primarch. Thus, the Iron Hands era, known as the Tempering, began. This conclave of the Iron Council stretched for solar days and weeks on end, with no rest, the debate raging endlessly. This was now a time of intellectual fervor, as each member of the Iron Council dissected every conceivable theory, philosophy, and course of action. This debate was often punctuated by passionate outbursts, but each instance of unchecked emotion was swiftly met with a stern reprimand. Ferrus Manus had instilled within the Legion an ironclad discipline, deep within every Marine, a sense of focus and control despite the tumultuous occurrences of the heresy. That iron within had not been lost. While the Primarch's own emotions had spiraled out of control in the end of it all, the Iron Hands could not afford the same fate. The Imperium needed them, and so they would meet the Imperium's needs as mechanically as possible. The lessons learned from the catastrophic defeats at the Dropsite Massacre and other battles had led to what the Tempering sought to enforce. As the 86th Medusan Day came to an end, the Council's deliberation would finally be concluded, and the rulings were put into motion. The Iron Fathers had decreed a chilling command. Humanity itself was to blame for the events of the heresy. The rebellion of Horus had garnered such traction because the Imperium, the Emperor, the Primarchs, and the Space Marine Legions had failed to rid humanity of its inherent weaknesses. Emotions such as jealousy, fear, greed, wrath, and envy had corroded the very foundations of the Imperium. This festering rot had made it possible for betrayal to take root within the hearts of the very warriors who were designed to ensure the protection of humanity. The trust placed in one another by the Primarchs had been a fatal flaw, one that had allowed the corruption of the traitors to spread unchecked until the heresy. This revelation would become a cornerstone of the Iron Hands' guiding doctrine. The traitors and renegades who had turned against the Imperium could not be allowed to spread their moral decay any further. Thereby, humanity's flaw must be purged, not only from their enemies, but from the very heart of the Imperium. The Iron Hands would then become determined that their mission was not solely vengeance. It would be a campaign of calculated ruthlessness, designed to eradicate all weakness and replace it with cold, unfeeling fortitude, which would forevermore define the Iron Hands. Thus, the Council's decision led the Iron Hands into their campaign of purification. The clan's companies, having been forged into powerful strike forces, would then be dispatched to confront those who were deemed as the greatest threats, be they traitor or still on the side of the Imperium. These actions would be dedicated not by emotion but by pure, unflinching logic, and the unyielding need to cleanse the galaxy of its inherent frailties. And thus was the beginning of the new chapter for the Iron Hands, one of vengeance tempered by discipline, where each action was guided by the cold calculations of reason, and where the Legion's survival, nay, the Imperium's, depended on their relentless pursuit of strength through sacrifice. Unbeknownst to the greater Imperium, the Tempering was not solely a moment of introspection and recognition for the Iron Hands. It was a pivotal juncture in their relationship with the Adeptus Mechanicus. With their Primarch lost, and the Legion reeling from the aftermath of the Horus Heresy, the Iron Hands sought not only to heal, but also a means of strengthening themselves through the mastery of technology. For centuries, the Iron Hands had fought alongside the Adeptus Mechanicus, their bond forged in the crucible of the Great Crusade, and solidified through the brutal conflicts of the heresy. Maintaining the Martian priesthood alongside its legions of titans had been invaluable allies to the Legion, as their shared vision of steel over flesh aligned greatly with the Iron Hands' new ideology. It was the Mechanicus that the Iron Hands saw as a reflection of their own doctrine, a symbol of their unrelenting, unending pursuit of strength through the mastery of the machine. Where other factions might have faltered and given into pride or ambition, the Mechanicus, or at least what remained of it, remained 100% committed to their worship of the Omnissiah. The Iron Hands in turn found that the Mechanicus were a perfect ally, one that would not fall victim to the same emotions of weakness that had doomed the Emperor's children and others to their downfall. This shared understanding of values and cold logic, along with mechanical perfection, made the relationship between the two factions both vital and enduring. It seemed as the only logical choice for the Iron Council to align with the Adeptus Mechanicus. The Iron Hands had long been intertwined with the Martian priesthood at this point already, and through the wake of the devastation wrought by the heresy, the need for closer ties was far more pressing than ever, leading to the decision being made. In exchange for the protection and military might the Iron Hands could offer offer, the Adeptus Mechanicus would grant the Legion unparalleled access to their technologies and any STCs that were deemed as being under their dominion. This arrangement would not only enhance the Iron Hands' technological edge, but also elevate their Tech Marines' knowledge far beyond the abilities of their counterparts in other legions or chapters. As the tempering drew to a close, the alliance would become formalized through treaties and pacts. The Voice of Mars, a position representing the Adeptus Mechanicus, would be stationed and established within the Iron Hands hierarchy as an official and permanent role within the Iron Council. This position would not be held by a singular individual, but rather a triad of senior tech adepts, each chosen for their unparalleled expertise in understanding the secrets and techniques granted to humanity by the Omnissiah. This new structure was designed to ensure that Iron Hands could draw upon the vast wealth of knowledge held by the Mechanicus, further embedding the influence of the machine god into the very core of the Iron Hands Legion. This alliance, forged in the fires of war, would prove to be one of the most significant turning points in the histories of the Iron Hands and the Mechanicus, as they rebuilt their legion while striding into an uncertain future. The knowledge and power they would garner from this relationship would prove invaluable. The machine god's blessings bestowed through the Tech Marines and the priesthood of Mars would ensure that the Iron Hands would remain as unyielding and unstoppable as the cold steel of machine that made up much of their bodies now was. The Iron Hands' philosophy of the flesh being weak was now deeply rooted with their unwavering and unending reverence for strength and the profound distrust for weakness, which had shaped their perception of the machine and flesh in ways that diverged greatly from the views held by almost every other Space Marine Legion. While many of their brethren viewed machines as powerful tools, the Iron Hands considered them far more than mere appendages or mechanical implements. To the Legion, the machine was the ultimate inheritor of the flesh, surpassing the limitations of the human body. Their emperor enhanced transhuman forms, though once human, were now living machines, flesh and bone given over to the mechanical, a perfect fusion of organic and synthetic made for war. These bodies, however, were not seen as final, but as works in progress, to be constantly improved upon through cybernetic enhancements. It was the Iron Hands' drive to embody the strength of iron, both in body and spirit, that led them to favor cybernetic replacements over more traditional regenerative or vat-grown methods of limb and organ replacement, which were common amongst other legions. The swiftness and efficiency of cybernetics allowed the Legion to quickly return injured legionaries back to the battlefront much quicker than the traditional methods of healing. This focus on rapid recovery and unending marches towards war led to a stark truth. No Iron Hands legionary who had fought in battle for any significant period of time was entirely free of bionic augmentation. In the Iron Hands, cybernetics were not a mark of shame, but of honor, and many of the Legion's most seasoned warriors intentionally sought out to remove their flesh and to augment themselves further, driven by the belief that their flesh was weak and that the machine was far superior. For those amongst the Iron Hands who had proven themselves in the fires of battle, the ultimate honor was not merely to fight as a warrior, but to eventually be interred within a sacred dreadnought, the towering machines of war that would allow them to continue fighting in the Emperor's cause far after their mortal bodies had all but failed them. To become a dreadnought was to transcend the frailty of the human flesh and to become a living instrument of vengeance, a symbol of the Iron Hands' belief in the supremacy of the machine. However, even Ferrus Manus, their revered Primarchs, had previously set limits to the extent to which the flesh could be replaced with steel. While the Iron Hands embraced cybernetics and bionics, Ferrus Manus, driven by his strict adherence to certain boundaries, forbade the use of any darker or more esoteric cybermantic technologies, as those they had encountered throughout the Great Crusade. Once he was gone, the Legion uniquely attuned to the forbidden practices and would seize on such discoveries. However, that was only after he was gone. Prior to that, Ferrus Manus would destroy or hide any of the said technologies found under his command. These forbidden sciences and practices of the Dark Age of technology remained shrouded in much secrecy, to the point that the Assagen protocols, the 8 sleepers, and and the Sarkozian formulae were all said to be locked away, sealed under the so-called Keys of Hell, a reference to the Medusan goddess of death. The dark secrets were concealed in deep vaults far under the world of Medusa's surface, and in the airless, lifeless moons orbiting the nearly dead star system. Only the most trusted Iron Fathers knew the exact locations of these buried horrors, yet many of them, despite their danger, were not destroyed, merely sealed away, guarded as forbidden knowledge that was never to see the light of day. Following his death, any shred of resistance within the Iron Hands to further augmentation of the flesh for machine began to falter, far quicker than it should have. Some amongst the Iron Hands came to view Ferrus's reluctance to embrace these darker technologies as a flaw and a fatal weakness that had allowed the traitors to strike down their Primarch. It was once said that the rage Ferrus Manus felt before his death was born of his mortal flesh, which had ultimately failed him. With his death, a shadow began to fall over the Legion, and the purity of Ferrus's vision weakened. Some within the Iron Hands began to question the prohibitions that he had set in place. In the chaos of the post-heresy era, the keys of hell, once sealed away, would be turned by a select few within the Iron Hands, and the path to heretical, forbidden, cybermantic knowledge was opened, leading the Iron Hands into quite frankly uncharted territory. Following the events of the Tempering, the Iron Hands alongside the other legions of the first founding found themselves permanently altered by the second founding. The once mighty legions were now split into smaller, more manageable, and less effective formations referred to as chapters, in strict accordances with the edicts of the Codex Astartes. As the 10th Legion, the Iron Hands' surviving clan companies would be divided, and while some of their gene seed was granted to the newly formed second founding successor chapters, the Iron Hands retained control over the 10 great clans of Medusa, ensuring that their legacy would continue, albeit in a starkly different form. Each of these newly created chapters received gene seed of their parent legion, but over time, as the Adeptus Mechanicus isolated and adapted the genetic lines, the Iron Hands successors would slowly evolve into separate and distinct entities. The designation of successor chapter was a rather unique one to those of the first founding. Later chapters created in subsequent foundings were not given this title. They would simply join the ranks of the 1,000 known as established chapters of the Imperium, an ever-expanding force to safeguard the galaxy. As a result, the term successor carries a special weight, as it is a direct lineage to the original legions that served the Emperor during the Great Crusade. Through the ages, the Iron Hands have proved instrumental in safeguarding the Imperium's far-reaching interests. Their actions, though often seen as ruthless and heartless, were recognized by many as unflinching in their fulfillment to the duty of the chapter, without the emotional baggage which would have weighed down other forces. This was especially true during the dark days of the 34th Millennium, when the galaxy was plagued by the malignant spread of the Pale Wasting, a disease that threatened to unravel the entire star system, be it human, orc, Eldar, or any other species within the Milky Way. The Iron Hands, never one to shy away from a challenge, were called upon to enforce a strict quarantine of the forge world of Grammaticus Beta, a vital hub of technological production for the Imperium. Clan Rukan, along with the other clan companies such as Kagrul and Hamak, were dispatched to assist in maintaining this blockade for months on end. Their strike cruisers would remain suspended in the void, silent and ready for action as they monitored the space around Grammaticus Beta. Their task was rather simple yet brutal: to prevent anyone within the world from fleeing the Pale Wasting and potentially jeopardizing the Forge world or its precious resources. In the vast, desolate reaches of space, the Iron Hands would go on to launch deadly boarding actions against any who dared violate the cordon. Orc raiders, Eldar pirates, and a myriad of other Xenos were the first to fall victim to the Iron Hands' cold mechanical efficiency. They would be driven from their vessels one deck at a time, their crews slain with ruthless bolter fire and precise blade work. The aftermath of each engagement was horrific. Bodies piled high and burned in order to prevent the further spread of the Pale Wasting. The wrecked ships scattered and sent hurling towards the heart of a distant star, ensuring that they could never threaten the Imperium or the wider galaxy again. But the brutality would not end there with the hostile invaders. The 26th Yermethi Regiment of the Astra Militarum, caught in the orbit of Grammaticus Beta were trying to flee the Pale Wasting, and as it could only be assumed that those within the ship may have been contaminated, it meant that they would also meet their end at the Iron Hands' swift but brutal assault. Confusion had led the Eurmethi to misinterpret their orders, sending them into the quarantine zone. When they tried to contact the Iron Hands, their calls went unanswered, as they attempted to reorient their ships in the warp, and it was then that the Iron Hands would act. Their fire patterns so efficient that thousands of Eurmethi soldiers would perish before they even realized they were under a full attack. The few survivors that were left with nothing but the chilling certainty of their fate. Their ships crippled and left helpless for the Iron Hands' boarding actions. The Iron Hands would show no mercy. Their doctrine was clear. Those who failed in their duties and who strayed from their post were to be punished without hesitation. The Eurmethi's desperate cries for help would go unanswered, as they had violated the quarantine and potentially endangered the rest of the Imperium. In their cold logic, the Iron Hands saw no place for weakness and no room for hesitation. To falter, to stray from their path of duty, was an unforgivable sin. The Iron Hands had fulfilled their duty in the most unflinching manner possible, and their actions, though brutal, were deemed as necessary, as was the iron will of the 10th Legion that had prevented the spread of the Pale Wasting within this sector. In the early 35th millennium, there was an immense time of turbulence within the Imperium. Following the Nova Terra Ingenium, the once unified Imperium was fractured into warring factions. Amidst the chaos, the Adeptus Mechanicus, already a complex organization, was once more torn asunder by internal strife. One of the most pivotal, decisive conflict would emerge, which was called the Morai Schism, a doctrinal and theological rift within the Mechanicus that would reshape the galaxy. At the heart of the schism were the writings of a triad of tech mystics from the remote forge world of Morai. These mystics claimed to have uncovered a hidden secret pattern in the fluctuations of the Astronomicon, the Emperor's psychic beacon, and through their advanced calculations they believed that these patterns had contained the divine word of the Omnissiah and the Emperor, offering a prophecy that would guide humanity's destiny according to its teachings. These revelations pointed to the eventual overthrow of the priesthood of Marge and the merging of the cult Mechanicus with the ecclesiarchy into a singular ecclesiarchal body that would govern the Imperium. Naturally, such radical doctrines were viewed as heretical by the Martian Orthodoxy, the ruling faction of the Mechanicus. This conflict between the two factions quickly escalated into a civil war, with skirmishes breaking out between the loyalists and the radicals. Despite the eventual annihilation of the Morai itself, obliterated by Mars's reclamation fleet, the heretical teachings spread quickly, gaining quite the following across the Mechanicus and beyond, including several regiments of the Tech Guard and the Titan Legions. This schism's influence would eventually reach the Adeptus Astartes, leading to chapters that were closely allied with the Mechanicus, most notably the Iron Hands becoming embroiled in this conflict. The Iron Hands, already deeply entwined with the Mechanicus, were especially affected by the schism. Clan Rukan, under the leadership of Iron Chaplain Frunros and Iron Captain Hekon, stood soundly and resolutely, all the while remaining loyal to the chapter's core beliefs. They were amongst the few of the Iron Hands clan companies that remained untouched by the schism, resisting the heretical influences, even engaging in battle against the rebellious Adeptus Mechanicus forces on the Forge World. This engagement saw the use of Vindicators and Predators to rout Cataphracti forces loyal to the radical doctrines. However, Clan Bargos, a faction within the Iron Hands, did not resist the heresy as strongly, ultimately supporting the Morai rebels, leading to a betrayal and the rift between Clan Burgos and the other clan companies, a divide that would continue to shape the Iron Hands. Amidst these tensions, a faction of the Iron Hands, led by Iron Father Setol Solex, embraced the radical doctrines. This was now the beginning of what could become a civil war that would threaten to destroy the Iron Hands from within. To prevent such a disastrous outcome, the Iron Hands ruling body, the Iron Council, would intervene with a solution that would set a peace. The dissenters who had adopted the Morai teachings would be exiled from the chapter's homeworld of Medusa, and a binding agreement was established to ensure that no blood would be spilled between the two factions. This exile marked the birth of the new chapter known as the Sons of Medusa. It is believed that nearly a third of the Iron Hands brethren chose to join the Sons of Medusa, a decision that was not without controversy. Some Space Marine chapters, notably the Red Talons, reportedly hunted down and destroyed many of these defecting brothers, unwilling to tolerate any form of heretical beliefs. However, the Sons of Medusa did not view themselves as traitors. They considered their exile to be temporary and would continue to perform their duties in the name of the Emperor, believing they remained true to the Imperium despite the separation from the Iron Hands proper. Over time, the Sons of Medusa grew in strength, bolstering their numbers and reinforcing their status as an independent force within the Imperium. Despite their exile, they retained their loyalty to the Emperor and maintained many of the traditions of the Iron Hands, even adopting their iconography and their signature war gear, albeit with some notable modifications. They formed a new set of 3 clan companies, continuing to expand and recruit their new members. By the 37th millennium, the Sons of Medusa's activities had attracted the attention of the High Lords of Terra, as the Imperium sought to reassert order in the wake of the Age of Redemption. The exiled Iron Hands were subjected to a thorough examination. Their loyalty to the Emperor and the integrity of their gene seed was scrutinized with extreme diligence. Despite the objections of the Mechanicus and some within the Imperium who still viewed the Sons of Medusa with great suspicion, the High Lords of Terra issued a special edict in 011 M37. The Sons of Medusa would be officially ratified as a new chapter separate from the Iron Hands, but still under the banner of the Imperium. Their position within the Imperium, now solidified, led the Sons of Medusa to be seen as loyal, though with a tarnished reputation. Their detractors referred to them as the Scavengers or the Carrion Crows, a reference to their habit of appropriating weapons and technologies from fallen enemies or allies, regardless of who they were, particularly those of other Space Marine chapters. This practice became a hallmark of their identity, one that would define them in the eyes of their fellow Astartes. Yet despite this mistrust that surrounded them, the Sons of Medusa emerged as a chapter which earned the grudging respect for their steadfastness in battle, particularly when the odds seemed stacked against them or insurmountable. They proved themselves time and time again as more than capable of holding the line against the enemies of the Imperium, even if their methods would remain controversial, including the supposed use of Necron and Tau technology. Sometime later, during the 37th millennium, the Iron Hands were once more called upon to demonstrate their strength in a response to a series of uprisings across the Imperium, leading to the Iron Council seeking to quell the threat posed by the renegade disciples of the Blind King, and so they would organize a vast strike force, which included Clan Rukan and no fewer than 4 additional clan companies. Their mission was rather simple: put down these rebellious actions and cease the spreading of these malignant, traitorous actions which were spreading like wildfire across the segmentum, and to confront the growing menace of the Blind King's forces. In a series of brutal and bloody engagements, the Iron Hands fought across numerous worlds, quelling uprisings with a degree of precision and brutality that only the Adeptus Astartes could achieve. The most notable of these campaigns was that on Pelos, where the Iron Hands launched an assault against the turncoat titans of Legio Corventia. In a battle that would become the stuff of legends, the Iron Hands formed a nigh impenetrable armored phalanx, driving the traitor titans back and securing the planet. This victory was celebrated as a monumental achievement, a victory that reinforced their reputation as one of the Imperium's premier military forces, despite them getting less adulation than others such as the Ultramarines. Yet beneath the surface of this triumph was a far more complex and troubling reality. The Iron Hands' victory had come at a cost, in particular that of prolonged doctrinal debates within their own ranks. While Clan Rukan and the majority of the Iron Hands remained rather steadfast and loyal to the Emperor, elements within the Iron Council began to question the validity of their own beliefs. Amongst these voices, there were those that suggested the renegade tech priests of the Osculad, led by the deranged Archmagos known as the Blind King, may not be entirely wrong in their radical views. The Osculad believed that humanity was an abomination and an affront to the Omnissiah, and that the Imperium should be remade in their own twisted image. These whispers of heresy threatened to tear the Iron Hands apart. Clan Rukan, and then Iron Father Darmos, was one of the fiercest critics of these views, dismissing them as madness and a betrayal of the Emperor's divine plan. Under his firm leadership, Clan Rukan remained solid in their beliefs, leading the charge against the Blind King's forces time and time again. The victories of this clan during the period are not to be understated, as the campaign was marked by both ferocity and honor, as they would win several notable battles, including the conflagration of Gold and the Bonehouse Massacre. These victories were seen as critical to the overall war effort, bolstering the morale of the Imperium and weakening the grip of the Blind King's forces. However, despite these triumphs, the Iron Hands could not ignore the undercurrents of dissent within the ranks. The Iron Council's inability to fully resolve the doctrinal conflict would have lasting consequences. For less than 200 years, under the leadership of Iron Father Drachmos, Clan Rukan would suffer one of their greatest and most crushing defeats at the hands of the very forces they had once triumphed over. The consequences of this failure would go on to echo throughout the entirety of the chapter, and it was in large part due to the inability to wrangle some of his own forces thanks to the doctrinal uncertainty. In the 39th millennium, the Imperium faced a rather unusual and dangerous threat. In 756 M39, the industrial world of Euanthos found itself under siege by the forces of Orc war boss Big Mech Rukaba. Known for his unusual prowess with force fields, Rukaba launched a daunting and devastating invasion as his massive asteroid fortress was able to disgorge hordes of orcs onto the planet's surface. The defenders were then overwhelmed in short order, and the mech quickly set about reinforcing their primary industrial complexes, Thanos. His weapon of choice was a giant hemispherical energy shield that enveloped the complex, and was able to be extended and reshaped however he needed it, rendering conventional weapons utterly useless against it. As the year wore on, the Imperial Guard, led by the Brimlock Dragoons, mounted a counteroffensive, but their heavy artillery proved ineffective against the war boss's invention. Even the might of the Brimlock Dragoons could not pierce this shield, as the situation would grow increasingly dire as the war boss turned the industrial output of the planet against the Imperium and to his advantage, converting assembly lines into factories for his creations, customized kilocans, death dreads, and stampas. The Dragoons found themselves utterly outmatched and outgunned. In desperation, the Imperial forces called for reinforcements from the nearby Medusa. Clan Kargul of the Iron Hands responded swiftly. Iron Fathers from the chapter analyzed the data collected from the ongoing battles, in particular focusing on the nature of the shields, as it became apparent that the shields effectively blocked high-velocity objects, such as artillery and fast-moving vehicles, yet it allowed slow-moving individuals to pass through with little resistance. With this knowledge, the Iron Hands devised a devastating strategy. A shield breaker cohort, resilient and deliberate in their movements, would be dispatched as they made their way under heavy fire across the outskirts of the city, and as anticipated, were able to walk right through the shield without a shred of hindrance. Their slow and calculated movements were able to bypass the Orcs' invention entirely. The Iron Hands, following the cohort's lead, proceeded to push deeper and deeper still into Orc-held territory, their knowledge of the shield's mechanics allowing them to fight their way through the Orcs' defenses quite easily, bringing the battle to the Greenskins en masse. Within a matter of days, the power source of the energy shield was located and destroyed, and the world would be reclaimed by the Imperium. The Orcs driven back into the void, and the tactical brilliance of the Iron Hands, combined with their meticulous analysis of the situation, would be publicized throughout the planet. However, not all campaigns for Clan Rukan were marked by victory. In 921 M40, the Iron Hands found themselves embroiled in a desperate struggle against the forces of Wag Skullsmasher. While defending the Merivian system, Clan Rukan received a distress call from the freighter Endymion, which revealed the presence of the Emperor's children. This message, however, was a ruse, a trick which allowed an ambush to be orchestrated by the worshippers of the demon Sapphire King. Iron Father Dermos, the leader of the clan, led his warriors in the pursuit of this particular threat. But what was meant to be a rescue mission quickly devolved into a disaster. The Iron Hands tracked the signal to the death world of Scarvus, and they were set upon quickly by the Emperor's children, led by the sinister worshippers of the Sapphire King. The battle that followed was a brutal and overwhelming one, and the ambush decimated the Iron Hands' forces, leaving the warriors of Clan Rukan scattered amidst the bone jungles of the planet. The destruction of their forces on the planet led to a devastating blow to Clan Rukan, and to the Iron Hands as a whole. Though the attack by the Emperor's children was a reminder of the constant dangers the Imperium faced, the ambush would leave the chapter changed and haunted for many years to come, Scavus becoming a cautionary tale for the entirety of the Iron Hands and many of their successors. In the early years of the 41st millennium, the Forge Moon of Gazia, located in the strategically crucial Agrothon system, was plunged into an unnatural eclipse. For an unknown reason, the moon, a once vital hub of industry and technology, was transformed into a nightmarish shadow of its former self. The sky over the world was consumed by a blackened radiance, as the moon itself became known as the Witching Moon, casting an eerie glow over the entirety of the star system. This malignant event triggered a widespread madness that savagely spread across its entire population. The once orderly and industrious populace descended into horrific acts of murder and madness, driven by the warp field phenomena that spread throughout the moon. The dark forces of chaos seemed to have seized control of the world. Led by dread entities of the Trabane and Company of Misery, these forces ruled as tyrannical overseers, ensuring that the world's populace remained under their horrific sway. The warp-infused light of the Wishing Moon spread calamity wherever it reached, tainting all it touched, threatening the stability of the entire system. The moon's madness rippled outwards, imperiling not only the world, but also Agrothian Prime, the system's most vital world. The initial Imperial response to this crisis was a swift, but ultimately unsuccessful assault. Squads from the Astra Militarum, supported by Battlefleet Ultima and elements of the Inquisition, would be repelled with devastating force. The defenders, empowered by the corrupting influences of the warp, fought with a savagery and ferocity that overwhelmed even the most senior of Imperial forces, with the madness of the Witching Moon being used as a weapon itself, rendering even the most disciplined troops unhinged after some time. The Imperial forces were left in shatters as they were forced to retreat, leaving the situation in dire straits, with the loss of tens of billions of lives seeming imminent. The turning point itself came when the Charnel Guard chapter of the Adeptus Astartes arrived at the 11th hour. Their timely intervention, alongside a sacred contingent from the Adeptus Sororitas Order of the Black Sepulchre, brought much needed spiritual and martial force to bear. Leading the charge, the Adeptus Astartes, followed by the holy relic known as the Book of Tears, which was a revered artifact said to have the power to ward off the maddening influences of the warp, would attack in full force. The sacred presence of the Sisters of Battle provided a stabilizing anchor amidst the chaos. This reinforcement, having arrived, renewed the assault on the moon, one that would become legendary as the Charnel Guard led the charge, with other Astartes chapters, including the Iron Hands and the Stormlords, along with the Angels Profreer, joining the fray later. This battle was fought across a landscape of soaring metal canyons as tank formations and gunships clashed in brutal engagements, while the brutal Zone Mortalis actions were carried out in the chamber halls of the moon's industrial infrastructure. The battle descended into a cataclysmic struggle for survival, where the forces of chaos were able to inflict severe casualties on the Imperials before being driven out and back into the warp. With the retreat of the Chaos forces, the final purge was carried out to ensure that all life on the moon was eradicated. This once thriving moon would then be handed back over to the Adeptus Mechanicus for a lengthy stay, along with the arduous process of tech exorcism and reclamation, which in part would be assisted by the attachments of the Iron Hands. In another part of the galaxy, far from the warp-induced horrors of the Witching Moon, Clan Rukan once again found themselves embroiled in a more conventional, though no less brutal conflict. In 123 M41, several squads from Clan Rukan, under the leadership of Iron Captain Garver, launched a swift and decisive strike against a band of Dark Eldar slavers who had been preying upon the agri-worlds of the Huradar cluster. The Dark Eldar raids up until then had been taking a heavy toll on the civilian population, and it fell upon the Iron Hands to remedy this situation. The fighting was rather fierce, and in the chaos of battle, several hundred agri-laborers lost their lives permanently. In the aftermath, accusations arose against the Iron Hands, claiming that the deaths of the civilians were not a mere byproduct of battle, but rather a result of the Iron Hands using them to bait and set an ambush for the slavers. Clan Rukan vehemently denied these accusations, asserting that the losses of civilian life were tragic, but were also the most expedient course in an action which would rapidly remedy the deteriorating situation. Despite the controversy, Clan Rukan's strike had been rather successful, and the Dark Eldar were defeated, their slaving operations completely destroyed within the sector, and all these vital agri-worlds were saved, though the cost of victory would leave no shortage of enmity between the residents of the agri-world and the Iron Hands. Hands. In 187 M41, Clan Rukan once again found themselves embroiled in a brutal campaign, this time on the war-torn world of Dicronus. The planet was a contested stronghold on the edge of Imperial space, which was underseen by the infamous Iron Warriors Legion, led by warsmith Lung Sul. Known for their ruthlessness and mastery of siege warfare, the Iron Warriors captured a significant number of Imperial Guard forces, whom they would hold in sprawling prison facilities. The captured troops were then subjected to intense mental reconditioning, transforming them into fanatical chaos cultists. This was a horrific fate, one that turned the once loyal soldiers into twisted mockeries of their former selves. As Clan Rukan launched its armored spearhead, they would be the first to breach the Iron Warriors' battle lines, confronting the reality of this prison facility. Upon discovering the extent of the mental reconditioning and the threat of further corruption, the Iron Hands, true to their unforgiving doctrine, took rather drastic actions. Faced with the possibility that any lingering survivors could not be trusted as being either loyalists or traitors, and the risk to the Imperium that would pose, they chose to exterminate all within. No distinction was made between the chaos-tainted and the still loyal guardsmen. Men, women, and children who had served the Emperor would be put to the sword all the same. Though the scale of this massacre was undoubtedly brutal and the deaths of potential innocents would weigh heavily on the consciousness of some, the Iron Hands were nonetheless lauded by the Inquisition's Ordo Malleus, who were also assigned to this war zone. To them, the extermination of the facility's inhabitants, regardless of their allegiance, was a necessary action to ensure the continued survival of the Imperium. The cost was a great risk, but a risk of allowing such a place to remain, or potentially chaos-corrupted individuals to spread throughout the Imperium, was deemed as far greater. The Iron Hands' actions were seen as a stark reminder of their uncompromising loyalty to the Emperor and the Imperium, no matter the moral ambiguities of their decisions. Several decades later, in 249 M41, the Iron Hands once again found themselves engaged in high-stakes conflicts, this time on the Forge world of Columnus, as a massive orc wog had descended upon the planet, threatening to overwhelm the defenders and destroy their vital production facilities, leading the Iron Hands to act. Moving swiftly, they deployed Clan Company Rukan once again, as they would play the pivotal role in repelling these greenskin invaders. The battles were fierce and rather destructive, but in the aftermath, the orc threat was utterly quelled. Questions would begin to arise within the Iron Council, in particular regarding the conduct of Iron Father Christos, who had led Clan Rukan's forces during the engagements. Allegations of questionable behavior and decisions made during the campaign led some to question whether Christos had acted within the proper bounds of the chapter's strict code. The matter would remain a source of tension within the Iron Hands for a long time to come, as questions of her leadership should not be without merit. Later, in 272 M41, Clan Rukan once again in the midst of a fierce and precarious war, this time against a warband of Thousand Sons Traitor Legionaries. The battle itself took place on the relic world of Dorloth II, a planet of great significance to the Adeptus Mechanicus due to its connection to the earliest days of the Mechanicum. Amidst the war-torn cavern ruins of the planet's surface, a strike force from Clan Rukan, alongside forces of Clan Company Grassak and Drovak, made a monumental discovery. Within the depths of the planet's vast underground network of chambers and tunnels, the warriors stumbled upon long-lost forge complexes, which were ancient relics from the dawn of the very Mechanicum itself. The complex itself was hidden for millennia, and it was a treasure trove of arcane technology and knowledge, containing secrets that could change the very nature of warfare for the Imperium. Though the chapter turned over much of what they found to the Martian priesthood for study and reclamation, they retained several powerful relics for their own use. Amongst these were the Mind-Forged Stave, an artifact of immense psychic potential, and the Gorgon's Chain, a mysterious and powerful piece of war gear, whose origins remain a closely guarded secret. The discovery of the God's Forge, as it would later be called, marked a significant moment of victory for Clan Rukan's history, as it served to bolster the chapter's eternal pursuit of knowledge and power, bringing even more fame to this clan. In 460 M41, the Iron Hands chapter was thrust into yet another conflict. Iron Father Christos, having ascended to the position of war leader, marshaled an overwhelming force of over 800 battle brothers, marking it as the single largest deployment of the chapter in centuries. Accompanied by the full presence of the Iron Council, this vast force set its sights on the Gahinda system, specifically its central world, Gahinda Prime. Here, Clan Company Rukan, as always, took the forefront. in what would become a nightmarish planetary assault. Unknown to them, they were marching directly into an abominable trap set by an ancient malevolent power. At the heart of the Horus Heresy was a demonic entity known as the Sapphire King, born from the psychic shockwave unleashed by the death of Ferrus Manus on Isstvan V. The Sapphire King was a creature of insidious power and subtle malevolence. Over the centuries, it had fed on the emotional scars of the Iron Hands, drawing strength from their deep unspoken despair. For the Iron Hands, warriors made of suffering and isolation, repressed all the emotions that fed it, viewing them as weakness to be excised. But the Sapphire King understood them better than they understood themselves. It knew that within their ironclad hearts, these battle brothers had a festering, untapped emotion, ready to explode if the right pressure was applied. The demon awaited patiently, watching as the Iron Hands buried their anger and sorrow beneath cold logic and discipline. The Sapphire King recognized their refusal to confront these feelings made them vulnerable, so it would sow the seeds of corruption, planting within each warrior a rancid seed, a latent bomb of repressed passion that could be detonated at any moment. The demon's plan was to ignite that bomb and to watch the Iron Hands collapse to chaos and self-destruction. As the battle on Grahinda Prime raged on, clan companies of Clan Rukan and Throgol pressed forward, unaware the conflict would escalate when Iron Father Christos, who had been unknowingly corrupted by the Sapphire King, led his forces into the heart of the enemy's stronghold. Here, the true nature of the trap was revealed, as Christos and his followers, known to him as the Christosians, were overwhelmed by the powers of chaos. The more they tried to suppress their emotions, the faster they succumbed to them. The battlefield would become a frenzy of bloodshed as howling demons of Slaanesh tore through reality, accompanied by the corrupted warriors of the Emperor's Children Legion. Amidst this madness, the Sapphire King emerged as a grotesque, bejeweled figure of unfathomable power. As it strode into the battlefield, it would seem as though the fate of the Iron Hands was sealed. But in the midst of the chaos, one warrior, Cardan Stronos, experienced a revelation. He would understand that the Iron Hands' attempt to sever themselves from their emotions had only made them more susceptible to this particular demon's corruptive influence. Their only chance at salvation led not in suppressing their feelings, but in confronting them and embracing them, thereby forging something greater, shackling their emotions to their iron will, rather than allowing their iron will to suppress them, or their emotions to rip their iron will apart. Unleashed, the Iron Hands now fought with an unending amount of determination. Stranos activated his Vox and issued a bold command. He ordered his battle brothers to release their anger and grief, knowing that only embracing said emotions would set them free from the demon's spell. As the Iron Hands freed their suppressed fury, the Sapphire King's power began to unravel, as the repressed energies that it was feeding on were quickly vented, and with a deafening shriek, the demon's hold on them was ruptured. Now unleashed, the Iron Hands fought with a ferocity that they had long denied themselves. In the cataclysmic surge of rage, they tore through the demonic forces, blasting Slaaneshi demons apart with their sheer firepower, and tearing Emperor's children to ruin. No longer shackled by their own fears, the Iron Hands, now immersed in the violence of war, came out on top. The Sapphire King, a once nigh invincible force of corruption, was utterly obliterated by the unleashed fury of the Iron Hands it had so cultivated, as the remaining Emperor's children had their numbers shattered, crushed beneath the unending assault. To ensure that the hordes of the demon engines were eradicated, the Iron Hands launched a massive orbital bombardment, scouring the surface of the planet. As the skies above the world burned, due to weapons of unimaginable power raining down upon it, ensuring that the demon's influence was permanently erased from the materium. The Iron Hands had faced an internal threat more insidious than any external enemy they had before, though through an act of willpower, they were able to forge themselves into a stronger version of Iron Hands, one which in theory would be even greater than that desired by Ferrus Manus. The aftermath of the Grahinda campaign had left the Iron Hands severely wounded, not only in numbers but in spirits, though manpower could be replenished, and the destruction of vehicles repaired or replaced. The psychological scars from battle, especially the revelation of how close the whole chapter came to falling to chaos corruption, proved far more devastating, as nearly a third of the Iron Council had succumbed to the seductive pull of chaos, their souls lost to the influence of the demon. These corrupted individuals, alongside many of the warriors who followed them, had fallen so deeply that their undoing would have far-reaching consequences if it was ever discovered by the Inquisition. The very foundation of the Iron Hands, which was built upon the uncompromising ideology of strength and logic, was now in question. The Christosians, a faction dedicated to the devotional following of the tenets of the tempering, had long since represented the chapter's most extreme interpretations of their founding principles, the beliefs of both iron over flesh and logic over emotion, as being the only true path forward. Yet in the wake of this heretical revelation, the Iron Hands were forced to confront the devastating possibility that this unyielding obsession with emotional excision and the perfection of the machine had in itself become a weakness. In their quest to purge all perceived frailty, they had been blind to the inherent danger of denying their own humanity and the weakness it was causing. As such, the Iron Hands would reel from the uncomfortable truth. The Iron Council, once a bastion of unshakable, unquestionable authority, now teetered on the verge of utter collapse. Panic permeated the Council's emergency sessions, as multiple theories and counter-arguments were posited, then swiftly dismissed. How could the chapter continue if the very principles that defined their existence was irrevocably tainted by the very weakness that they had long sought to expunge? In this moment of crisis, it was Cardan Stronos, the warrior who had essentially saved the chapter, who would rise from his seat and command attention. He disconnected himself from the mechanical interfaces of his body and armor and addressed the council in a voice free from the unusual rigidity of his own augmentations. He spoke of the chapter's new insight, casting their trials not as a devastating defeat, but rather as a test and a gift, one derived from the God Emperor's very own creation, themselves. Despite the forces that sought to lead them into darkness, it seems that the Iron Hands had been granted the chance to see the flaw within themselves, and through confronting said flaws, they had triumphed. With a booming declaration, Stronos delivered words that would reshape the Iron Hands in the very future. With steel we are stronger, but without a soul we are nothing. These words would become enshrined across Medusa, carved into iron glass plaques and passed down through generations, as a reminder of the pivotal moment when the chapter faced a potential unmaking. That day, despite the lingering opposition from the remaining Christosians and the voice of Mars, Xantros was unanimously elected as the new war leader of the Iron Hands, a position that would hold and he would be re-elected to time and time again for the rest of his life. His speech had not immediately undone centuries of indoctrination. One address could not so easily erase a deep-seated conviction that had been brought about through generations. However, it was the beginning of something far greater, a shift in perspective that would unfold over the following centuries, slowly and methodically improving the Iron Hands in ways they hadn't considered before. Under Stronos' leadership, the Iron Hands would evolve, and the number of Iron Fathers, including the elevation of Epistolara, Lydrak, and the Iron Chaplains Shuglar, steadily grew, with many of the chapter's librarians and chaplains rising to prestigious ranks. While the Iron Council continued to operate with cold and calculating logic that had long been their hallmark, they would become much more attuned to the dangers of unchecked obsession and the risks of heresy abandoning humanity could lead to. Crucially, many efforts were made to temper the most inhuman impulses within the chapter, and a more balanced approach would become to take hold. On the battlefield, the Iron Hands would continue to wield the might of steel machine, but this time tempered by the enduring wrath of their Primarch Ferrus Manus. They would not abandon the perfection of the machine, but many battle brothers inspired by Stronos' vision would temper that steel with the fires of their rekindled soul and the strength of their flesh. The legacy of Cardan Stronos had functionally reshaped the Iron Hands as much as that of Ferrus Manus had once done. Later, in 742 and 41, the Imperium launched a large-scale military offensive known as the Damocles Gulf Crusade, aimed at repelling the newly arisen Tau Xenos threat. The conflict itself unfolded in the Lethish sector, a region stretching from the Damocles Gulf to the Purdus Rift anomaly in the eastern fringes of the galaxy. The strategic goal of the crusade was to push back the Tau forces, which had begun to encroach upon several subsectors and eventually force the Tau back to their homeworld, where they would be rightfully purged from existence. This crusade was spearheaded by a formidable vanguard, which included 12 capital ships of the Imperial Navy, 5 crusade companies of various Adeptus Astartes chapters, and a litany of Imperial army forces. The fighting strength was drawn from some of the most renowned and battle-hardened forces the Imperium had to offer: the Ultramarines, the Scythes of the Emperor, the White Scars, and the Iron Hands. These Astartes, supported by 19 regiments of the Imperial Guard, would also include 7 regiments raised specifically by the Ecclesiarchy of the World Brimlock. Together they would engage the Vile Tau in a series of pitched battles with the goal of driving them from Imperial space. However, the crusade was ultimately a stalemate, as the Imperium was forced to halt their offensive on the Tau-sept world of Delthur in order to contend with a far greater threat, the encroaching Tyranid Hive Fleet Behemoth. As the Tyranids pressed in from the galactic core, the Tau, perhaps realizing the fluidity of further conflict, extended an olive branch, opting for diplomatic negotiations instead of continuing war. The Tau military allowed the Imperial forces to withdraw without further resistance, thereby ending the first significant military engagement between the Tau and the Imperium. Though the crusade failed to bring its primary objective to fruition, it provided the Imperium with valuable insights and lessons in combating the Tau. These lessons would prove instrumental in subsequent Imperial campaigns on the worlds of Nimbosa and Medusa V, where the Tau would once again find themselves at odds with the Emperor's forces. In 810 M41, the Iron Hands found themselves amongst 9 Astartes chapters tasked with liberating the Kaldar system from the grip of Wag Grozod, led by the savage Orc warlord Grazod. Following the crushing victory against the Orcs, a grand feast was organized by the governor of Kaldar Prime. To honor the heroism and sacrifice of the Adeptus Astartes, every chapter with the exception of the Iron Hands attended this celebration. The refusal of the Iron Hands to participate was not a matter of disrespect, but a deliberate choice to abstain and a statement of disdain. The Iron Hands would not share a table with the Raven Guard, whose actions and philosophy they viewed with great suspicion. This public refusal to dine together with other fellow Astartes was a powerful declaration from the Iron Hands in the belief of their own path. In 812 M41, the Iron Hands' reputation as a merciless fighting force of the Imperium was further solidified during the purge of the Conqual subsector, as the taint of chaos had spread throughout this region thanks to High Governor Conqual, who had succumbed to the seductive power of Slaanesh, the god of excess and pleasure. From the governor's court, the corruption had spread like wildfire, seeping into the very fabric of the subsector. Within a matter of weeks, the entire region had been teeming with chaos cultists and heretical forces. Tasked with eradicating said corruption, the Iron Hands responded with a ruthless swiftness and precision that would become their hallmark. Under the command of Lord Commander Avran Ralph, the Iron Hands stormed the subsector with a terrifying efficiency, striking before the forces of chaos could organize any meaningful resistance, and quickly moving on to the next target. Their primary target was the hive world of Sardunus, where a vast number of chaos cultists had used forbidden rituals to tear a portal into the warp. From this rift, the demonic monsters of the Neverborn poured forth, threatening to corrupt the material realm permanently. The Iron Hands would fight through these monsters with the relentless fury of a storm, cutting down both heretics and demons alike. Despite being vastly outnumbered, the Iron Hands pushed forward with a terrifying discipline, forcing the inhabitants of the subsector to surrender. Many of its citizens, realizing the magnitude of their treachery, begged for mercy, but the Iron Hands, driven by their deep-seated hatred for anything chaos and anything related to the Emperor's children and Slaanesh, showed them none. Their cleansing wrath was absolute. Once the subsector was secured, the Iron Hands enacted a brutal purge, executing 1 in every 3 civilians as punishment for allowing chaos such a foothold. This grim retribution served as both a punishment and a reminder to the survivors that the Iron Hands would not tolerate any such weakness, and any further wavering in their faith would be met with a swift and uncompromising action of cold and calculated retribution. In the aftermath of this purge, the subsector was left in a state of utter devotion to the God Emperor. The populace, now fully aware of the outcome should the Iron Hands be called to cleanse said corruption again. In the year 999 M41, the forces of Abaddon the Despoiler erupted from the Cadian Gate, launching the 13th Black Crusade, an event that sent shockwaves throughout the Imperium. The Iron Hands, given the precarious position of their own homeworld of Medusa, knew the full weight of the threat they now faced. Nestled in the very edge of the Eye of Terror, Medusa was all but guaranteed to be one of the first targets of the incoming Traitor Legions. As the looming shadow of the invasion grew nearer, the chapter moved swiftly to prepare their defenses. While it is known that 2 of the clan companies were dispatched elsewhere to fortify key regions, the bulk of the chapter's might was focused on defending their ancestral homeworld. The Iron Hands understood that the strategic importance of Medusa was paramount, as they could not yield it to the forces of chaos without a brutal fight. The largest confrontation of this defense came when all 10 of the chapter's gargantuan tract fortresses were mobilized in order to face the Hardani 13th Heavy Armored Regiment, a formidable traitor guardsman garrison. The battle itself unfolded on the plains of Medusa, and it would become one of the more significant armored clashes in recent Imperial history. It was said to rival even that of the infamous Battle of Talran, fought during the Heresy, where over 10,000 tanks stormed through the desert planet. However, this time it was the Iron Hands who awaited their enemy's advance. As the traitors closed in, the mobile fortresses, which were massive fortified structures capable of devastating power, were prepared to meet them head-on. On the 5th day of battle, the enemy pressed ever closer to the Iron Hands, unleashed a devastatingly blistering first volley, firing with a precision and force equal to that of the Centurio Ordinatus of the Adeptus Mechanicus. In an instant, over 100 enemy tanks were obliterated, their hulks burning on the barren plains of the world. However, the traitors were relentless and unyielding, pressing forward despite their own heavy losses. At the battle's peak, the traitor guardsmen succeeded in breaking through the Iron Hands' lines. An armored company of traitors outflanked the Iron Hands' mobile fortresses, enclosing on them and firing at nearly point-blank range. Eventually, the battle would reach its critical juncture when the Iron Hands, knowing the defense of Medusa hung in the balance, launched a desperate counteroffensive. Assault squads, blistering with melta-bombs, launched themselves from the towers of their mobile fortresses, landing on top of enemy tanks before jumping and moving on to the next one. Many of the Astartes were cut down as they descended, their bodies torn apart by the furious pineal-mounted weapons or crushed beneath the heavy treads of the heretical vehicles. Yet their sacrifice was not in vain, as this relentless charge disabled or destroyed the majority of the traitors' armored squadrons, including their tanks, sending their forces into a chaotic retreat. But the battle was far from over. The Iron Hands, rallying with a fury of warriors driven by the defense of their own homeworld, unleashed massed armored assault of their own. From their fortress, waves of Predator Annihilator tanks surged forward, their weapons unleashing a torrent of las cannon fire. The tanks of the remaining traitors were quickly overwhelmed by the weight of the Iron Hands' counterattack, their hulls torn apart by the deadly beams. By the end of the campaign, the Iron Hands had fully secured Medusa. The once looming threat had been all but eradicated permanently, but the cost was significant and the carnage rather deep. However, the chapter was not only able to protect their home, but also mobilized additional clan companies to bolster the defense of the Cadian system as a whole. By the end of the campaign, the Iron Hands would secure Medusa fully. The Iron Hands' victory allowed them to further strengthen the Imperial defense efforts, with a naval task force dispatched, in particular, to reinforce the naval world of Vigilatum. At an unknown date in M42, the Imperial forces retreating from the Stygius sector during an invasion were met with the Iron Hands standing firm, while other Imperial forces chose to fall back at the face of the overwhelming chaos. The Iron Hands refused to abandon their post. Their conviction carried them to the beleaguered world of Mordian, which was currently under siege by Chaos forces. Here, alongside a mere remaining handful of Mordian Iron Guard regiments, the Iron Hands sought to purge the weakness that they had been shown earlier in the campaign, striving to reforge the populace and to reaffirm the unyielding devotion to the Emperor that every Imperial citizen should have. The siege of Mordian would become a crucible in which the Iron Hands would further test their resolve. In what would become known as the Iron Crusade, the chapter was joined by several allies, all united by their desire to extract revenge on the Chaos forces. Amongst these allies were the Brazen Claws, the Fire Lords, the Silver Skulls, the Sons of Medusa, and the Iron Lords. Each of these chapters, enraged by the perceived defeatism amongst the Imperial forces, converged on Mordian in order to turn the tide in the favor of the Imperium. Upon their arrival, the Iron Hands found a planet ravaged by the presence of the Night Lord's warband, led by the infamous Ahakar Deathshriek and his legion of raptor hordes. Deathshriek had terrorized the planet incessantly, instilling fear in the Mordian population in order to fuel a chaos ritual he had prepared that would transport the entire world deep within the warp, a fate that could have doomed the entire world of Mordian permanently and all of its inhabitants. The Iron Hands and their allies struck with a signature bluntness by emerging from the warp without warning, as they engaged the traitor fleet in orbit while simultaneously launching a drop pod assault on the capital city of Mordian. Leading this charge was Captain Kenork Var of Clan Averny, who through brutality drove Deathstreak's forces back. One by one, the other clan companies of the Iron Hands would join the fray, overwhelming the forces of Chaos in single combat. Var wounded Deathstreak, signaling a shift in the battle's momentum. However, the traitors would not be routed so easily, as the Iron Hands' positions faltered from the fresh assault thanks to the Benedictine Guard and the Cult of the Whispered Word. A coalition of renegade warlords realized their opportunity to annihilate the Iron Hands once and for all. Deathstreak, emboldened by this new threat, rallied his forces and led a powerful assault on the Iron Hands warships, outnumbering them 3-1. At this critical moment, reinforcements arrived. Loyalist successor chapters rushed to aid the Iron Hands, disrupting Deathstreak's armada and sending them into utter and complete disarray. The new Loyalist warships turned the tide of battle, at least in space, but the war was far from over. The Iron Hands unleashed their old and reliable, yet devastating, Hammer and the Storm Doctrine. Their orbital bombardment, seemingly indiscriminate, was anything but. The Iron Hands Tech Marines had covertly reinforced several surviving bunkers within the Mordian's capital, erecting void shields to protect key positions while the rest of the battlefield would endure this heavy bombardment. In under an hour, the Chaos Forces' grip on Mordian was completely broken for a second time. The Iron Hands delivered a crippling blow to the forces of Chaos. Once the skies had been cleared, Imperial reinforcements from Krypamundi arrived, allowing the Iron Crusade not only to push back the forces of Chaos, but to lead a counterattack on their forces in nearby worlds. With Mordian now secured, the Iron Hands Iron Council set in motion the second phase of this campaign, a mission to cleanse the surrounding worlds of the Mordian system, reclaiming refineries, orbital shipyards, all throughout the Corvus system. However, regardless of what had happened previously, the Iron Hands' overall struggle to defend their homeworld was far from over, as an unprecedented assault from Typhus, the leader of the Death Guard's first plague company, would occur, as he launched a raid on the world of Medusa. Joined by war bands of the Cleaved and the Purge, along with several other Nurglite renegade forces, Typhus and his band of Plague Marines arrived with a singular devastating purpose: reduce Medusa to a toxic, decaying husk. The Iron Hands had already suffered significant damage, forcing their clans to rally again to protect their homeworld. After a fierce conflict, they succeeded in repelling the attackers, driving them back. However, the damage inflicted upon Medusa was catastrophic. Regions of the planet were left essentially permanently cursed and designated as quarantine zones, their environments irrevocably scarred, and the disease of corruption brought by Typhus's forces left there in perpetuity. However, the galaxy grows ever darker, and even the Iron Hands, known for their unwavering resolve, find themselves constantly caught in the escalating storm of challenges. The Iron Council, once a pillar of stability and wisdom, now faces internal strife once again, and the unsettling reality of allies falling prey to mindlessness and corruption has left them ill at ease, as they cannot help but reflect on the past, haunted by the long-forgotten decisions and the bitter losses they led to. As vast swaths of the Imperium are consumed by chaos and turmoil, they are left wondering what the future holds for their chapter. In particular, the Council itself has noted changes in its own ranks, transformations brought by the leadership of Cardan Stronos. Under his guidance, Clan Rukan has flourished, epitomizing a shift in the chapter's once unyielding position. These changes, though momentarily invigorating, also serve as a stark reminder of the darker aspects of their history. It is impossible for the Iron Council not to draw on parallels between Stronos' rise and the tragic fate of their former Primarch, a father lost to his own bitter end. With such reflections weighing heavily on their minds, the Council is left questioning whether the logic of their conundrum has any rationale to it. Amidst these doubts and concerns, the Iron Council has called a great conclave known as the Grand Calculation. This gathering will determine the future of the Iron Hands chapter and their role in coming conflicts. A war unlike any other the galaxy has ever seen is now underway, and the Iron Hands must decide where best to commit their might. Will they scatter their strength, as has often been the case in past campaigns, or will they instead consolidate their forces and strike decisively, pushing against the most pressing to humanity with the full force of their chapter? The members of the Iron Council now must remain stalwart in their beliefs that overwhelming force is the key to victory, but they know that they cannot afford to act without deliberation. The Iron Hands will not entrust their fate to the capriciousness of chance.